Hello, this is Grandmama, and welcome to another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. We told you last night in our scrapbook how Dave Fleet, the young engineer, came along and made up Sam Ben's mind about platting a town here where Wishkah and Chehalis rivers come together. Well, there's more to the story. In fact, it's the beginning of the story of Aberdeen, the first real chapter in its history. If you remember, if you were with us last night, Sam Ben was going to plat the pasture land and add it to the city of Wishkah, over on the east bank of the Wishkah River, the town that W.F. Parsons had plotted. That was what Sam Ben planned to do when he started Dave Fleet, the young Virginia engineer working on the survey. Well, the weeks went on and Fleet was running his traverse. He was driving stakes in the tidelands to locate the center of streets that are now Wishkah River, Heron, and Market, and another that Sam called Hume, a street that wallowed in color and excitement until its residents changed the name to State Street. Market Street, Sam decided, would be the main street of the town. It would be wider than the rest to take care of 6 or 8 carriages abreast if people came in those numbers. There were to be 53 blocks in Sam's town. It would run from a street called Broadway on the west to Ben Street on the east. Ben Street would adjoin the town of Wishkah that Parsons had already platted. The town of Wishkah, as it was projected, would straddle the Wishkah River and the center on one side of the muddy stream. But about that time, fate took a hand. Sam Ben told me this part of the story. It was about the time that the patriarch was closing in on his 100th birthday. His mind was clear and keen. He realized even the smallest detail as he told of the birth of the city. It was just after Christmas 1883 that Dave Fleet began to lay out Ben's pasture early in February. Sam Ben had occasion to make a trip down to Ilwaco on the Columbia River. He made it by the usual route, down the river to Westport, or Peterson's Point as they called it then, onto the little steamboat, the Governor Newell, then down the beach to Tokeland, where there he ferried across Shoalwater Bay, which we now call Willapa Harbor, and went overland to the fishing community on the Columbia. His trip was for the purpose of discussing business with an old friend, B.A. Seberg, who operated the Aberdeen Packing Company. You see, Sam Ben operated a small cannery. He called it the Washington Packing Company, not far from the present site of Junction City. It was a seasonal proposition, but when the salmon ran, the Indians gathered them, and in the canoes, Sam packed the big fish for Eastern tables. What he learned about salmon packing he passed along to his friend Seberg, and what he needed to know, Seberg often provided. They purchased supplies together and often sold their packs together to get the right market price. Well, after they had swapped yarns about fish packing, Sam confessed that he had fallen for the boomtown fever. He described the work in progress back at his farm. Seberg agreed that everything except the idea of adding it to Parsons' town of Wishkah. "Start your own town, Sam," he said. "Be your own promoter. Besides, Wishkah is no name for a self-respecting city." They thought of possible names, and Seberg, who was the fond native of Scotland, was demonstrated by the name of his cannery. He argued for Aberdeen. It wasn't the first time that the name had come up. Miss Jim Stewart, one of Sam's few neighbors, had suggested Aberdeen. She also hailed from the land of the Scots. Sam couldn't see a reason for starting a new town where one was already underway. The name kept going through his mind, though. He was thinking in terms of Aberdeen when he jumped from the bow of the Governor Newell to the big stump near what is now the foot of F Street and started across the pasture towards home. When Sam talked it over with his engineer, David Fleet was all in favor of Aberdeen. "I used to go to the Aberdeen Academy in Virginia," he told the founder. "That's a good name." So when Dave Fleet and George Ben had finished their survey and the engineer had put the last lines on the drawing of the plat, he turned to Sam and asked, "What will we call it? Ben's addition to Wishkah or Aberdeen, Washington?" It didn't take Sam long to make up his mind. "Call it Aberdeen, Washington," he said. "Definitely." And the die was cast. A few weeks later, the Portland Oregonian carried the story of the new town being started up on Grays Harbor, the second near the mouth of the Wishkah River, it stated. On the 16th of February, Fleet filed the paper in Montesano, and J.B. Dabney caught the next boat to Aberdeen and bought 9 corner lots in the prospective city. That was Sam Ben's first sale. But there were others within a week. Speculators came on almost every boat down from Montesano. Some came up the harbor from Peterson's Point. They looked, bought lots, and sat back to watch what would happen. But nothing much did. Oh, Sam set about putting through some of the streets. He slashed some of the scrub trees and filled and leveled here and there. But the summer of 1884 came and went without much sign of a town there on the banks of the Wishkah. Then along in the fall of 1884, a stranger came to town. He was a straight, plain-talking man with a wide, sweeping mustache and an eye for timber. His name was A.J. West. He had been a lumberman in Michigan, and with the timber becoming scarce back there, he had gravitated west. He spent several days going over the harbor. He looked at the mill site that George Emerson showed him on the Hoquiam River. He poked along the south side down by Peterson's Point and up as far as Cosmopolis, which was a name without a town. It had carried the designation Cosmopolis ever since the 1860s, but now an engineer named Nims was hustling to get the town laid out and complete the boomtown business. When A.J. West had seen it all, he came back to Sam Ben and bargained for a piece of land at the mouth of the Wishkah River. The ground was adjoining Parsons' plot of Wishkah and was almost in the center of the lands plotted for towns by the 2 developers. Within a few months, West's new mill was building. Machinery was coming up from Portland. Mill irons, they called them. A crew of local men were hard hewing timbers for foundations. Over in Cosmopolis, the Fry sawmill was operated with water power and was turning out an order of lumber to construct the buildings. Well, in a few months, a settlement had sprung up around the sawmill, mostly on Parsons' Plat, and the settlement kept the name of Wishkah in defiance of Sam Ben's bigger plot across the river. It looked like Parsons might build a city while Sam Ben kept his pasture land for his cows and horses. But A.J. West was pulling strings. Back in Michigan, people were hearing about Grays Harbor and its tall timber. Letters sent back, a few travelers who had seen with their own eyes, and stories that filtered through the long grapevine. They all told of the land of opportunities. One day, a letter was delivered to the office of J.M. Weatherwax, who ran a little lumber operation at Stanton, Michigan. It was from West. It told of a new wealth of timber to be had, the new logging grounds that had timber shows big enough to last for time to come. That summer, J.M. Weatherwax came west to see for himself. What he saw sent him hurrying back to Michigan to pack up his sawmill, boiler, and edger and load it onto a lake steamer for shipment up the St. Lawrence. On the coast, it was reloaded into a schooner to be shipped around the Horn of the West Coast. He returned across the continent to meet his sawmill as it came into the harbor after the voyage of more than 15,000 miles. There was a crew on hand to assemble the mill, though it took a bit of revising to make the little carriage that worked well enough in Michigan, heavy enough to handle the 5 or 6 foot furlongs. In fact, everything had to be beefed up a bit before it could take on the strain of our big timber. But they put it together on the mill site that J.M. Weatherwax had purchased from Sam Ben right at the foot of Broadway. And now Sam Ben had a sawmill of his own, and in his own township, and a cluster of huts that grew around it began to make Aberdeen look like it might be a town after all. With 2 mills cutting lumber, this became a busy spot. A floating dock was built by the Governor Newell to pull up to. The towns began to grow together, and in 1888, under provision of the Territorial Act, people of the 2 towns got together and made it one town. They incorporated their new city and called it, as Seaburg had predicted they would, after Sam Ben's side of the river. It was a city to be called Aberdeen. It still wasn't much as towns go, and if you were to talk down its unpaved streets, between its rows of wooden buildings, you'd wonder that people had so much assurance of this little community. But they did. They came down to the harbor on river boats and on old trails over hills. They looked and they liked it, and pretty soon they were taking a hand in building the city. Take Jimmy Hood, who he hooved into town in 1886 and opened a general store. He was open less than a year when a fire burnt his store building and destroyed his stock. But he built another and bought more merchandise. At the Republican nominating convention in Walla Walla, he was the first governor of the new state of Washington and was nominated. The first congressman named Jimmy Hood represented Chehalis County. Take the Pratchett's. They came to Aberdeen. Mr. Pratchett accepted the position of postmaster, but death took a hand in things. His mourning friends buried him and comforted his widow less than a year after he had arrived. Mrs. Pratchett was a real frontier woman. She took the family savings and built a store building. She filled it with stocks of groceries and stationery and notions. It became the town's leading grocery store in less than a year. And if you think that young widow didn't build for a future, take a look at the building she built. It still stands on the corner of Wishkah and F Street. It's occupied by the Up and Up Cafe. Take R&H Evans, who came out to work in George Emerson's sawmill over in Hoquiam. He, it was, who guided the young Dave Fleet through the timberlands of the Wenatchee and the Wishkah in search of a timber claim. With John Lewis, who had come west to help J.M. Weatherwax put his mill together, Evans opened a real estate office and trafficked in Sam Ben's lots and blocks. Oh, it was a city with few conveniences. As the mills piled up their mountains of yellow sawdust, it was hauled in to fill the streets. The buildings were raised on posts on each side of the streets, and plank sidewalks connected them. As the mills sawed, the sawdust increased, the streets were filled in from sidewalk to sidewalk, planked for a hard surface. It was years before they got a street lamp stage, but it didn't take long to get a hotel. J.B. Dabney, together with his brother Richard, erected a hostelry on one of their corner lots near the foot of Heron Street. The boat landed nearby, and it was in the center of the town's social life for several years. Well, that's the way it started. 2 men with a single thought and a different ways of going about things. 2 towns that started out to compete and became one before they got to be a city. A handful of people with faith in their new hometown and the willingness to work. And that's the story of Aberdeen's beginning as we find it in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.